Today, we're going to talk about how do you vote when you go to the polls as a Christian. I have the answer for you, but it's not what you think. So, as we begin, let's get a few things out of the way. This little short message is for Christians. If you're a Christ follower, these are some things that you can maybe think about that will help you when you go to the polls and make your vote count. Again, it's my opinion, so it's based on some biblical principles, but it's my opinion, so take it or leave it. I'm not preaching from the pulpit here to give you definitive truth. I'm giving you some tools that maybe you can use as you analyze how you should vote. And my third assumption here is everything that we as Christians are called to do should be gospel-centered. So whatever we do, whether it's voting or living any aspect of our lives, it should always be gospel-centered. So, how should we vote? There are many ways that people approach voting. Vote for the most patriotic candidate that's out there. That's one option. The question is, what makes a candidate more patriotic than another? Some Christians vote their morals. They vote for things that are biblically pure and against things that aren't. So it's really a vote for anti-this or anti-that. And it's, which morals will this candidate uphold as opposed to which ones will this candidate not uphold. Again, that's kind of arbitrary. A lot of people also vote, what's best for me? How is this candidate going to help me? Is he going to lower my taxes? Is he or she going to give me more benefits or whatever? It's really a me-centered sort of vote. Again, there's a lot of answers that are out there how you should vote. Some of them aren't necessarily wrong, but the question is, what is the best? As a follower of Jesus, what's the best way to vote? So let's start out with some principles. If you don't agree with these principles, then you and I are probably on different pages, and what I'm going to say is really not going to make any sense to you whatsoever. So principle number one, this is the first thing I work from when I think about how to live my life. The first thing is this: this world is not our home. We are sojourners. We're just passing through. So this world is not a home. Therefore, voting for the short term really has no lasting value. Which brings me to the second principle. We are called to have an eternal, not just a temporal world view. There are some things that will pass away, and there are some things that are eternal and will continue on. God provides that perspective for us. So, that perspective is this, principle 3. God's purposes are more important than our own. What God wants is more important than what I want. God's passions are more important than my passions. So this is the key to voting. This, for me personally, this is how I look at voting. If God's purposes are more important than my purposes, then the key to voting is this: what is God's ultimate purpose? And how can my vote, when possible, accomplish that? How can my vote accomplish God's purposes while I'm here? This is a question I think we should ask really about everything that we do. How can the thing that I do help promote God's purposes for the world, for my life? So I do think our votes matter as much as anything else that we do in life matters. So how should we vote? We vote by asking this question: which candidate or which policymaker will enact or uphold policies and laws that will allow free proclamation of the gospel? Which one of these candidates, which one will promote freedom to proclaim the gospel's message without restrictions? That candidate, he or she, will have my vote. Who will give the church more freedom to proclaim the gospel, and who will do some things that would maybe quench that ability to proclaim the gospel? It's really a free speech question for me. Which one will allow me to do the things that God called me to do in greater freedom? That's it. That's how I vote. Which candidate will help me proclaim the gospel? Which candidate will allow me to say things that promote God's agenda for the world rather than anyone else's agenda? Why? Because that's what's most important. The most important thing in the universe is people. That's what matters most to God. That's why Jesus came and died. He wants people to come into a relationship with him. He wants people to hear the good news of Jesus Christ, and he wants to hear people proclaim the good news that will change people's lives, that will bring them salvation. That's God's heart, and that's God's passion. So ask the question before you place your vote. How can my vote reflect that purpose as much as possible? Now, at any given time, there might not always be a clear choice. There might not be one candidate to vote over and above the other candidate. But here's the issue. Having that priority in my mind, God's purposes over my own, is much better than getting there and voting for my conscience or my desires, or voting out of anger or because someone said to. Matter of fact, any other purpose that I might have should pale in comparison to me going to that poll booth and saying, what does the Lord want me to do? How can what I do with this pen promote his purposes in the world? This idea of the necessity to preach the gospel drove Paul in his mission. This is what he says in 1 Corinthians 9:16. Let me read this to you. He says, preaching the gospel is not something I can boast about. I am compelled by God to do it. How terrible for me if I don't preach the gospel. For Paul, the gospel was the main thing. All else came after that priority. If we understand that this world is not our ultimate home and that it will pass away, if we understand that any human band-aid on any problem the world gives doesn't have eternal value, it is simply temporary. If we adopt God's purposes as our own, then I think voting with the idea of the proclamation of the gospel in mind will free us from all the stuff that sways us one way or the other and gets our minds off of God's desires for the world and for my life, which includes my vote. People need to hear the gospel. Nothing is more important. Nothing at all is more important. And our vote should reflect that truth. From Romans 10:14. Listen to this. This is so clear. And this is why it matters so much to vote God's purposes. But, Paul says, how can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they've never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? Someone has to say something. Can God's Spirit move in a place where there is no freedom of speech? Yeah, he does it all the time. There are many places around the world and throughout history where the gospel has been squashed by the lack of the ability to proclaim freely. But it's not happened yet here, at least in America. So the question is, how can we leverage this ability to vote for God's purposes so we can have more freedom to proclaim the gospel? See, the more freedom, the better. So I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm simply saying when you go to the polls, when you consider how you're going to vote, why are you voting? Are you thinking, how can I use my vote to proclaim the gospel for his glory and his glory alone?